Vols are in a really unique spot right now. Josh Heupel is going into his sixth season as head coach of the Vols, and all things considered, I mean, they finished 8-4. We knew that there would be a little bit of a regression considering that Nico transferred to UCLA, Dylan Sampson went to the draft, and a bunch of guys on the defense side of the ball also graduated, and some of them went to the draft as well. So we knew that there would be a little bit of a turnover, and we knew that there would be some transition. But they definitely fell off a little bit, particularly in the defense side of the ball, which is a big reason why they decided to fire Tim Banks and go with Jim Knowles, which, in my opinion, is probably one of the most underrated hires in the entire cycle. Now, I think the one caveat to hiring a guy like Jim Knowles, and I think you see this within his track record, whether it was at Oklahoma State under Mike Gundy or Ohio State most recently, or even Penn. Well, we're not going to count Penn State, right? But Ohio State and Oklahoma State. My point is that it took about 2 or 3 seasons for them to really kind of see a top 10 defense from these guys. So I think defensively speaking, it is going to take probably at least a season and a half to really kind of implement Jim Knowles' system, because it is a little bit convoluted. Now, they did a pretty good job with getting to the quarterback in terms of getting pressure. They tied for 5th with 36 in 12 games, but everything else, quite frankly, was very lackluster in terms of the defense side of the ball. Now, I think there's a couple different areas that we can kind of touch upon here. I would say, first and foremost, Tennessee kind of felt like a team that gave up a lot of big explosive plays, at least defensively in the secondary. Tennessee allowed more than 33 points in each of their 4 losses this year. And also versus SEC opponents this year, SEC opponents averaged 33.6 yards per play. And then when they concluded the season, Vanderbilt put up 45 on them. So that's really just a long-winded way of saying is that Tennessee is going to have a lot of question marks on defense side of the ball, and Jim Knowles is going to have his work cut out for him, because yes, they got to the quarterback a good amount, but the defensive line, particularly in terms of rushing defense, they really got out physicaled and pushed around a lot. The linebackers, although a lot of them are athletic, particularly on the edge, a lot of them seemed out of position, were missing assignments, and ultimately that kind of derailed that element of it. But the good news is when you have a guy like Jim Knowles, and as long as you have a little bit of patience with him, historically speaking, they've been able to find a way to get it done. Now, to give the Vols some credit here, the Music City Bowl was a really fun game versus Illinois, even though, Illinois had 220 yards of rushing in that game. And, of course, you're still kind of finding your way a little bit in terms of your offensive identity, because what have we seen from the Vols in the past couple of seasons? I'm talking after, Milnen and Hooker and all those guys. The Vols proved in the past couple of seasons that they can be a really great run-heavy team, even though, they do love to air it out sometimes, but they prove that they can be a really fun run-heavy team. And, the Vols, they average 173.5 yards per game, which out of the past 5 years is significantly the lowest margin that they've had. And, it definitely raises some alarm bells, but, at the same time too, I think you had to anticipate that to some degree. I think Joey Aguilar, even though we kind of saw what his limitations were towards the end of the season, you kind of knew what you got out of him, right? I mean, people, if you watched his film at Appalachian State, you know that he's a kid that can really air out the ball. You know that he's got a solid arm, but he's not going to be the kid that necessarily takes you to a national title game or an SEC championship game. He's a solid kid that can certainly get you to a bowl game, but really not much more than that. But fast forward to now, and Tennessee's quarterback situation is fascinating to say the least, because, when you think about the quarterbacks that Josh Heupel has worked with, the $1 million question for me is, how come Tennessee has been unable to add a transfer quarterback? Now, I know that they're really high on 5-star kid Brandon, who was the number one overall player of this class for several months now. And this isn't me saying that they can't start him, because I certainly think they can. So maybe that's the message that they were trying to send. I don't quite think so. I think they've struck out on a lot of different guys, whether it was Sam Levitt, whether it was Josh Hoover, whether it was presumably, I think, Menza, since he's going to Miami. So, I mean, evidence has shown that they've tried to get these quarterbacks, but it kind of makes you wonder, how come they're striking out? Is it an NIL situation? Is it just kids not wanting to play for Heupel? Is it just the fact that you're kind of sandwiched in between being a above average SEC team, but not necessarily at the top echelon where you're necessarily competing for the SEC championship? Because, from what a lot of recruits probably saw this year, was the majority of their wins were against under 500 teams. And I would argue that they should have won the Georgia game at the beginning of the season. And I think that loss kind of, in many ways, kind of set the expectation, or sort of the what's to come of Tennessee football, I guess, is the best way to phrase it. But even, let's just say they roll with Brandon, which, by the way, I totally think they can do that. You have Mecklinger, who transferred to UConn, and you also have George McIntyre, too, who is a really, touted freshman coming in. He's going to be in his sophomore year now. I've seen clips of him on Twitter and whatnot, throwing to the Vols receiver. So it clearly seems like they have some rapport there, and he's definitely a kid that I would say at the very least is a pretty solid insurance policy, and something that I think if you're a Vols fan, you want to keep your eyes on this kid in terms of spring football and see if he can push Brandon a little bit further. But outside of all these different, changes that we have at Tennessee, the one thing that they are doing a damn good job at is recruiting. This is the fourth straight top 15 finish for Heupel, and it's a top 10 class, just outside, just within the top 10 at number 9. And there are a bunch of kids that they added this year, right? They added 5-star tackle Gabriel Asanda. They have 5-star kid Tristan Keys, who I think is going to be a really strong kid for them. And then on the defense side of the ball, you also have 4-star linebackers TJ White and Brandon Rouse, which I think are going to be some really strong contributions. Especially, I think they need a lot more depth within that linebacker room after they lost guys like James Pierce Jr., Omar Norman, and Elijah Sanders, back in the draft. So I think they definitely kind of have to rebuild that, and this is definitely a step in the right direction, right? A total of 28 kids in this class. They have about, I think, 6 or 7 transfers right now, which I only anticipate being higher. But, Tennessee, I mean, here's where they're at right now, right? They're looking for a bounce back campaign after, I think, for the most part, an 8-4 season that at least suggests to me that Tennessee's probably going to be able to figure this out, right? I mean, the offense has never been ranked outside the top 20. Through Heupel's, tenure as head coach at Tennessee, they have found different ways to win. I love the fact when they're, a run-heavy team, but they've also shown some versatility, be able to air it out, particularly in the play-action game, and, getting a lot of those explosive wide receivers going. But at the same time, it's just going to be a question of how quickly can Jim Knowles implement his scheme and kind of clean up the sloppy play that we saw at linebacker and some of the big explosive plays that we saw in the secondary. Because I think the one thing that I think was missing from this Tennessee defense, aside from, just the physical, toughness aspect of it, is really just sound fundamentals, right? I think they got penalized a lot this year, and I think that ultimately that kind of took its toll towards the end of the season. But either way, I mean, you're going to have a young quarterback in either McIntyre or Brandon, and you can't enter the 2026 season with 2 scholarship quarterbacks. So even though I think it's good that they try to take a couple big swings, you're kind of at the point now where you need a second insurance policy behind Brandon. You have to bring in a veteran backup or a kid from, kind of the group of 5 setting that is willing to compete for the starting job. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions between, Josh Heupel and Joey Hazel and this entire offensive staff in terms of, you know, how do you make sure that you get this quarterback as comfortable as possible in terms of, getting him implemented quickly and getting that confidence going? How do you make sure that this rushing attack kind of gets revitalized, considering that they've had the fewest average in the past 5 years? And how quickly can you get this Knowles scheme going? But overall, it just seems like a team that has a lot of good things going for them. Definitely going to be, quite frankly, a much younger team than years past. But Heupel has shown the capability to be adaptable, to have some versatility, and I think there will be some growing pains with this Tennessee football team, but ultimately, I think they're able to figure it out and get things sailing in the right direction to the point where we might see them with a double-digit win total. Maybe not in 2026, but perhaps 2027, depending on some of those variables that I discussed earlier in the video.